that's an interesting thing. In the past, I've been to our church, and we've had the Good Friday service. Yeah. And I remember one in particular that ended with a big bang. And people might not know what that was, but basically what it was is somebody had a very large book, and there was a table in the back. And just as the service was ending, someone slammed that book down. And I was told that was to symbolize the stone being closed over Jesus's tomb. And then everyone leaves in silence. And then it's like years and years ago, I was like, so I wonder why we're leaving in silence, because I hadn't really talked about it or asked, because I didn't know to ask. It was like, it's just what we did. And so it sounds like you want to like walk into that and find out what's about to happen with that, or that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you can think about is the Gospels provide us a certain amount of information. There's some other piece of information we can pull, and then we can even talk about what church tradition has said about this time. But let's consider the time between Good Friday, what would be really at the time about 3:00 in the afternoon ish, when the Lord has already at that point said, "It is finished." These are one of the 7 last words from the cross. And then when he gets to the very end, he commends his spirit into his Father's hands, and that's when he expires. Basically, that's when he dies. And the centurion, of course, is watching, and and his reflection is surely this man was the Son of God. So okay, but from there you've got things that are going to happen and unfold. And it's clear to understand that the sacrifice has been made. So the Christ has given his life for God's people, for all people, so that we might not die eternally. And now that sacrifice has been made. And really, I mean, this will sound like I'm being trivial about it. I'm not. There's a crushing blow that comes with that final death. But in one respect, for the person who is undergoing the experience, death is simpler than dying. I mean, they'll tell you that dying, boy, they'll say that's the hardest work you'll ever do. So, and I've been a lot of bedsides of people who are dying. Obviously, they weren't dying terrible, violent deaths like a crucifixion would be, but there's a great
dying nonetheless.
They're dying. They're usually fighting for breath, and so it's not. It's hard work. It's exhausting, and then in that sense, death does come as a release from the agony that you were being put through. So Jesus has bowed his head. He's given up his spirit, and now, the finished work on the cross is just that. It's finished. It's completed. And we got to ask, what are the things that are happening now between this point and, of course, the celebration of Easter, because that's, there's this time in between. And, so the very first thing we note in the Gospels is that the disciples didn't want, or even the Jews, they didn't want that's the way to think about it. The Jews didn't want the people on the crosses up for when the Sabbath was coming. Sabbath begins, Shabbat begins on Friday. It's going to begin at roughly, it's going to come down at sundown, so roughly 6:00. So at 3:00, they're starting to think to themselves, we better hurry this up, because every single person, crucified that day, the 3, Jesus and the 2 thieves, one on his right, one on his left, they want to make sure that they can bring the bodies down off the cross. Well, they're not going to come down alive. That's good for sure. So the Romans are going to break the legs of anybody that's still breathing and fighting, because that'll hasten the death. Well, they get to Jesus, of course, and that they discover he's already died. They put the spear into his side, and what comes out is water and blood. But the other two, they did have their legs broken, presumably, and then they died, relatively fast. Well, what happens next? Again, this is sort of a recap of Good Friday, is that Joseph of Arimathea, and at least in John's gospel, he's accompanied with by Nicodemus, and they are going to ask for the body of Jesus so that they can take him down and put him where I guess where they could say this is a good temporary place, because everybody's expecting at this point that the whole saga's over. They're not thinking like Easter Christians yet. They're thinking this is the end of the road. Well, we're going to have to do right by the Lord and give him a proper funeral, but not in between now and when the Sabbath starts. So let's just temporarily put him somewhere. And the closest available tomb was a new tomb nobody had ever been and put in. And I believe that this is owned by Joseph of Arimathea. And so he provides it, and Jesus is placed in that tomb. Okay, so that's how Good Friday ends. One thing that we need to mention, though, is, again, are there other things that are going to happen between now and Easter sunrise, or even slightly before the sunrise? Well, there's no activity at the tomb other than the guard that's posted, right? There's a desire to make sure that no one tries to steal Jesus' body, so they're going to post a guard and kind of secure the tomb, at least until other preparations can be made, and so nobody can say that he rose again. They want to make sure that that's kind of eliminated as a possibility, so they're going to post a guard. But sometimes the question is asked, what happens between Friday and Sunday? Well, the smart alecky answer would be, well, Saturday, right? It's the day in between. And actually, the church does observe that. They call it by different names. Oftentimes, they call it Holy Saturday. And the idea is that in many churches, a vigil is held that is going to be the vigil of Holy Saturday. It's going to be leading up to the celebration of Easter. So, and I'll talk more about how that's observed, because there's some differences. Like, there's some differences between how Roman Catholics observe it and how Eastern Orthodox Christians observe it. But remember the one part that when Jesus was still alive and he was on the cross, and the two thieves, right, are crucified, one on his right and one on his left, and one of them is hurling insults at him, right?
Right.
And the other one gets after him, saying, don't you fear God, because we're getting what we deserve, that this man has done nothing wrong. And at that point, that thief, excuse me, turns to Jesus and says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. It's a profound statement. I mean, it's a profound expression of faith.
Yeah, I've often pointed out that what happens there is something, it's kind of ridiculous, because, this person who's supposedly going to have a kingdom doesn't look at all like he's going to have the kingdom.
This doesn't look like there's a victory here waiting to be explored. Right. There's a crushing defeat, as far as natural eyes can see.
Right.
Okay, but Jesus tells him, he tells him that this day you'll be with me in paradise. Okay, well, we know that Jesus died at, again, about 3:00 in the afternoon, and presumably both the thieves, but the thief in question here would have died a little after Jesus, but still more than likely before the Sabbath began at sundown. So, so in the spirit, these Jesus had promised him that he's going to be with him in paradise. So I think we can infer from that that in the spirit realm, or however you want, if you want to talk about Jesus, as in his soul, however is the right way to talk about it, is no longer in the tomb. The body is certainly in the tomb, but Jesus has gone to in some sense, to this paradise that he spoke of, because he promised the thief that he'd be with him there.
Right.
So you got to say, well, when did this happen? Well, it happened between Friday and Saturday. So how long? When did it happen? Exactly. Does time even work the same way once you're out of this material world? I don't know. A bunch of I don't knows are going to start coming up pretty much one after the other. There's another thing that we talk about, and the Orthodox talk about this as well, is the idea that, well, Jesus, even if he was in paradise, at some point we talk about his descent into hell. Now that's something that we mention in the Apostles' Creed, right? That's one of the things that is confessed in the creed, is he descended into hell. And oftentimes the point is made that hell there, the word isn't the same word used to mean the place of fiery punishment. It's the word that could be translated with the Greek word for grave, the land of the dead, typically Hades. And sometimes I think in some Christian traditions, they back off from the whole idea of any kind of descent into the realm of the dead, because, well, for reasons I don't know why. But so others in reaction to that say, oh, no, for sure the creed says so, and Jesus went actually to hell. Well, it makes a difference that it's not the same word. And the other thing is confusing about that is that, well, then that leads some Christians to think, okay, well, if I'm a sinner and I die in my sins, I'm going to die. I'm going to die a physical death, and that's going to be, a bad experience, presumably. And then where would my soul go? This is how some Christians are going to reason. They're going to reason, well, I would be sent to hell to pay for my sins, basically. So there's this reasoning. It's erroneous. It's a bad chain of logic. But they'll say, well, Jesus is paying for the sins of all people, so he also has to undergo the terrors and the pains of hell. So he's going to go to this, and he's going to be punished. And the reason why Lutherans don't believe that at all, is that Jesus clearly said in John's gospel, it is finished, right? It is finished. So the payment for sins has been done. The redemption price has been paid. So there is no more to pay. There is no more suffering. In fact, that's why we can talk about, again, sort of the release that death brings. It's not the agony of dying anymore. We even say that he rested in the tomb, right? You've heard that kind of language before.
Right.
So, well, rest after you've been through something that has been exhausting, something that has been terrible to have to undergo. To get a rest from that is a good thing, right? So resting in the tomb is actually, in one respect, it is burial. Sometimes we look at this as the steps of humiliation versus the steps of exaltation. And you can say, well, crucified, dead, and buried. Buried meaning here's the great Son of God, not only now dead, but buried into the earth. So kind of the lowest he can go. and I understand that. And then so that's why the next phrase in that explanation is, he descended into hell is not a further step of humiliation, but as we're going to see in a second, Lutherans explain it as the very first step, sort of the preliminary step of his exaltation. So it has nothing to do with punishment at all, at least as far as we're concerned. And I really only can think of maybe some Protestant groups that are not quite with it. I guess that's the kind way to say it. That
You
would
mean the word faithers that
well,
have
I don't know. I don't
frequently
know what
preached.
I don't know what their group is like. I don't know where they get this idea, but they want to. They want to have the experience of descent into hell. First of all, they want it to be a descent into hell, flames and pitchforks and everything else, not simply a descent into the realm of the dead. And they do imagine that this is for the very final completion of payment for sins. So I can completely say that's wrong. Okay, now what is the descent into hell then? Well, here you have some differences of opinion. So there are two places. We know that it's mentioned in the creed, but that's not going to be for us good enough to say, well, he must have gone to hell or gone to Hades because it says so in the creed. Where does it say so in Scripture? Right? We do have the place where he's talking about, today I'll be with you in paradise, or you will be with me in paradise. So identifying that in some sense Jesus goes to, even if that's not a literal way to talk about it, goes to paradise, or is in the realm of paradise, however you want to think of it. There's another way that we have to square it up with a passage. So we might as well turn to this passage right now. It's in 1 Peter, and it's chapter 3. And I don't know whether you have it perhaps in front of you, but I've got it in front of me. And 1 Peter 3, there's a lot of people have some question about how to interpret this, because it has lent itself to many interpretations. We're going to get to a couple of them. So it says in chapter 3, let's start at verse 18.
18.
It says, yeah, for Christ also suffered for sins once for all. So once for everybody. And I think it's also correct to say, and, once, one time for all time, there's no more additional. So again, that eliminates the idea of additional punishment. And so it says he suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, right? So they crucified, they nailed his body to the tree, and he was crucified, and he suffered until he died. So and then of course the sentence goes on, but made alive in the spirit. So would you read? Now here's the thing: verse 19 and 20, and we'll pause just a minute before we get to one of the favorite Lutheran proof verses of 21. But just read 19 and 20 for a second.
19 and 20?
Yeah.
Okay, so beginning with 19, it says, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water.
Okay. And then we're going to read the next in a little bit about baptism. But baptism, while it's a great verse, is not really about, he's making a point about baptism, but baptism here doesn't figure into exactly this idea of made a proclamation or preached to the spirits in some versions who are held in prison, right? These are spirits held in prison. This sounds like they're spirits that are, well, they got a problem if they're prisoners. Generally, prisoners, they are either there because they deserve it, or maybe they're unfairly imprisoned. But He was made alive in the spirit. So he goes in the spirit to this place where he can preach to or proclaim to the spirits in prison. And then the description of them is who in former times, they didn't obey God while everything was being patiently being building in the ark and such, and so this makes it sound like they've been, well, if these spirits go back to when Noah was building the ark, that's way before the days of Jesus and the first century Christians. So this is much earlier. These have been prisons held in spirits held in prison a long, long time. Okay, so here's a few different thoughts about it. Again, one will eliminate the idea that the realm of the dead here is actually hell as a punishment. That doesn't make sense, and that doesn't fit with this verse either. Some people would say, well, okay, here's what Jesus did: is he preached to all these Old Testament saints who they needed to still get saved. They didn't know about Jesus. They didn't have an opportunity to be Christians because they lived before the time of Christ. So they've got to go to this sort of holding cell. It's not, the bad part of the prison, but it's not the good part either. There is no good part.
That's what the dispensationalists do with it. Yeah.
Okay. So that's the idea, is that, well, then he's going to preach to them what the truth is. They'll have a chance. That means that these are human souls, human spirits who have an opportunity after their death, in some cases, like a long, 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 long time after their death, if they've been there since the time of Noah. Again, what does time mean in this place? I don't know. But his idea is that he's going to preach to them, they're going to get the opportunity, and then they're going to be released, or at least they have the potential to be saved. Okay, so that's not really what we believe, because for one thing, we don't think that you're going to have a second chance to reevaluate your situation after you've died. I'll hold off what Lutherans teach on this for just a second, but the next part is the way the Orthodox understand it. They call this the harrowing of hell. And it's the idea is that Jesus goes to where the dead, the good, the bad, just the dead period, are imprisoned, and he is going to begin reversing death. They don't really have this idea that the Western Church has, that everything's got to wait for a general resurrection after the second coming of Christ. They don't divide it up that way at all. They think that the descent into hell between Good Friday and Easter is already when the dead spirit, the human spirits, are being released from the prison. So it's a very different way of looking at it. The Lutherans look at this and they say, well, we don't think that he is preaching or proclaiming to human spirits at all. They think that these are spirits held in prison because they are evil spirits, evil non-human spirits. And what Christ is preaching and announcing to them is the victory that God has won over them in their realm of darkness. So however you look at it, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't matter. It does matter. The thing is, we're not going to sort it all out here. This is what that evidently has to happen prior to Easter Sunday, because after Easter Sunday, he's not simply dead in the body and alive, made alive in the spirit. He is again embodied. When the tomb is empty or opened, it's empty. He's not there. Why? Because his body is with him, or he is in his body, however you want to look at it. So that's, of course, what's going to be the celebration of Easter. That's going to start according to Mark's gospel, very early in the morning while it was still dark. So sunrise is not even really, you're getting the first glints of some light, but for Mark, it's not even a full sunrise yet. And well, that's the celebration of Easter. And so churches will have perhaps an Easter vigil. And in that Easter vigil, they're going to recount what Christ has done and recount his rest in the tomb. Liturgically, oftentimes, Catholic churches will have this Easter vigil that starts the night before, when they will baptize those who are going to be brought into the church so that they can receive the Lord's Supper, receive Mass, basically, on Easter Sunday. But there'll be the baptisms that are in preparation. There's prayers, there's scripture readings. Then you get finally to the very beginning of Easter, and you're probably going to have, even in Protestant churches, it's not uncommon to have more than one Easter service. Sometimes it's called a sunrise service, right? Sometimes you'll have the larger assembly coming at the regular church time, which probably isn't sunrise, but they'll have a regular service. And so, well, that's how we begin turning from Good Friday through Holy Saturday to Easter celebration of resurrection. It's a beautiful thing that the church in more than one tradition has preserved this turning from the one focus on the darkness of Good Friday and the cross to the light and the joy of Easter. So I'm excited. That we're entering into this Easter season, and we get to now speak about the power of Christ's resurrection in our own lives.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think about what Jesus said to the thief on the cross, and I wonder what it is that he said to the people in prison. Was it something similar? The gospel being preached to those who, had imagined that. I mean, and it's a good thing to hear, because we don't remember the gospel very easily, and probably without I'm actually convinced that without something like Easter, it would be forgotten altogether. I mean, we would go through the motions of Christianity, and we just completely forget the gospel.